fact that there was a revolution in Iran, that there is a Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, that there is a Hamas in Palestine, that there is a revolution in Egypt, that there's been civil war in Algeria. Aren't these things in fact tied together? And aren't we seeing a historical reaction? Isn't there a building confrontation between American and Israeli interests in the Middle East and the perceived interests of the people of the region? And you're shaking your head a lot. But this is a question for everyone. And let's open this up. You don't have to rely on me to point my finger.
Let me just respond to what I started saying already. That is the gap that I'm talking about between Arab governments, many of which are unfortunately unelected governments, and their people.
We agreed before you came to be extremely candid and call it straight, so you can call the Arab governments, especially now that I know you're not working with the Arab League. You can call them whatever you want. Most of us call them despotic, ruthless, certainly unrepresentative and undemocratic, and police states.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is that they are really unelected. They apparently are not representative of the majority of their people, and what you just pointed out to is some, or maybe the beginning of a reaction to fill that gap between the reaction between their governments, which is supposed to represent their interests, their feeling, their best interests to the outside world, and what is in fact being projected by those governments. And the gap is beginning to appear, and I think the movements that you pointed to are in my opinion an opposition political parties, opposition groupings under whatever guise, whatever title, whatever, but they are opposition parties to what has been taking place in the Arab world. And I think you're very correct. They're growing, they're multiplying. Just one has to just watch what has been happening since the Israeli attack on Lebanon. It's like the pot is really boiling in the Arab world, from Yemen to Tunisia to Egypt to Jordan to everywhere.
And is Hamas, at least in part, a reaction to a generation or two generations of British and American imperial interests in the region? Let's talk about Hamas, because after all, Abu Mazruk is the political leader of Hamas. He's in jail because of that.
I want to add, I think, to the point that Ghassan was talking about. Actually, the American policy cannot have, its cake and eat it too, because for long it's known. I mean, you cannot put the people down forever. That's a fact in history. I mean, we should learn. But coming back to this here, the Israelis, of course, trying to use all these. You just talked about this situation with Hamas and Algeria and all these things, and use it and try to convince the American government and the American policymakers that they have to go 100% with Israel and forget about the Arabs, because sooner or later the Arabs or the Muslims are going to turn against America. And this, of course, serves only the interest of Israel, and that's one of the reasons that they wanted Abu Marzouk. And the Israelis, I believe, in their calculations, they know that they have no interest in Abu Marzouk. I think going even there is not going to really serve their interest per se as far as Hamas concerns, or putting down Hamas organization. But they're looking for a broader interest, which is trying to alienate America from the Arab world and the Muslim world, and they will be leaning more toward Israel more and more. And this is to the best interest of Israel, but it's not to the best interest of America. And that's where it comes in again, the question you earlier raised, why Americans should care. The Americans should care because this is exactly what Israel is doing, trying to tell America 200% with them and 100% against the Arabs, and at the end it's not going to serve the interests of the country.
I'm concerned about another alienation as well. That's the alienation of the American people from the American government. As the American government becomes more absorbed with fulfilling the interests of foreign countries, then instead of having the much called for democratization of the Arab governments, instead what I see is an Arabization of the American government. People have been referring to this. People have noticed this alienation, but they've attributed it to issues about, economic centralization and things like that. And that may be a part of it. But I think there's also the issue of the civil liberties that we talked about before. And I think there's also the issue of the feeling among the American public that the American government is not operating for their interests, but is operating for the interests of whether it be Israel or Egypt or whomever. And also, I find it interesting that the same groups that some of the same groups that lobby for the interests of Israel are ones that lobby, for example, for gun control and other measures that have become highly inflammatory in recent years, resulting in even terrorist acts taking place in the United States in the aftermath of Waco, for example, and caused not by Middle Easterners but by Americans of long standing.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, and I'm the host of this program at East Realities. We're talking about Hamas. We're talking about the arrests of the political leader of Hamas, and I'd like to read just one short paragraph from the conclusion of a publication that was published here by the UASR. The scenario: America, pressed by Israel, arrests Hamas leaders in jails or extradites them. Either action would attain the same result. Hardliners in Hamas will target U.S. interests, forcing the Americans, theoretically, to crack down on all Palestinian Muslim activities, charitable, media, and political, on its soil, and pursue Islamicists abroad. This publication was written last year. Now in 1996, some of this already seems to be coming true. There have been statements in the Middle East recently about taking Americans hostages and making Americans pay. How serious is this, or is it just a lot of the kind of rhetoric many Americans have sort of come to expect from the region?
Well, there's a lot of things. Let me try to take this on. There's a lot of expressions concerning the Middle East that tend to be rhetorical. But in this particular context, I don't think that we can dismiss this as rhetorical. And I would like to broaden that statement. That statement says Hamas may be put, or paraphrasing it, Hamas may be forced to take retaliatory action in the form of terrorist acts against Americans, etc. Looking at the larger picture in the Middle East, I don't think it's only Hamas that's being forced to resort to these types of drastic or radical actions. We can add to Hamas other areas in the Arabian Peninsula, in Lebanon, in northern Africa. I think, it's comfortable to look at the Arab-Israeli problem and then begin to point out extremists. The Jews have extremists, the Arab side has extremists, and once these extremists begin to do their thing, then nothing can be solved. Well, what we are seeing here is the United States government joining the extremists. When the United States government is taking sides against a legitimate party to this so-called dispute, in the fashion that it has done, it has classified itself, and this is where
You're speaking about Hamas.
I'm talking about the United States government in its approach to the whole Hamas phenomenon, and in the arrest of Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk. Before the arrest of Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, there was this ambiguity area. The United States government may have passed, and this is questionable, but let me put it across, may have passed as a type of fair arbiter in this dispute between extremist Muslims and extremist Jews. But when the United States went on the offensive, and this can be easily interpreted by Muslims throughout the Middle East, arresting Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, arresting Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman, passing laws in Congress that are intended specifically against Islamic organizations and Islamic associations in the United States. This gives credibility to those who are saying that the United States is a great Satan. And so the United States right now has joined the extremist flux in the Middle Eastern issue. It no longer can pretend to be equal-handed towards these and equal-handed towards those. The United States policy, and let me add here before it slips me, that it's not a precedent in the Middle East when you take someone who belongs to a political military organization, that this political military organization is going to react against perpetrators of unjust acts. There were American ambassadors killed in the Middle East because of taking Israelis taking prisoners. There were acts against American interests in the Middle East because of Israeli aggressive occupational military policies in the area, and hence the United States used to be on the receiving end when it was blindly supportive of Israeli policies. Imagine what the United States is going to be receiving if it jumps the Israeli policies and places itself in the forefront of initiating acts of aggression against people, individuals who belong to the other side of this issue.
The irony, of course, is that the United States is treating Hamas now exactly like it treated the PLO for a generation before the Israelis decided that they were going to deal with the PLO.
This is a point that deserves some clarification and explication, because I think that one of the things that people forget in treating Abu Marzouk as if he were a terrorist, people are going against his role as a political leader. And one of the things, if you want an enduring and lasting peace process that's successful, you want to be able to have a loyal opposition within Palestinian society. No one in Palestinian society is in a better position to fulfill that role right now than Hamas. But Hamas is being denied the opportunity to fill that role. And in particular, all you have to do is look at the recent elections. A condition was put on participation in running for the highest offices that people had to approve over the peace process in order to run. Palestinians. This was not applied to the Israelis. The Likud could run for office and will be running for office in the upcoming Israeli elections, even though their attitude towards the peace process is at least as hostile as that of the Hamas.
But isn't that the issue? Isn't the issue that the Israelis have found their interlocutor? They want to deal with Yasser Arafat because the deal they can get from Yasser Arafat is a deal that no other Palestinian leader is willing to accept. So Hamas is being ostracized because Hamas has a following within Palestine but will not pursue the kind of peace process. So in the end, we talk about the peace process. So in the end, we have to explain that for most Palestinians, it looks like they're being put on reservations, not that they're being led to statehood.
Exactly, and for the United States to be taking sides in that asymmetric way makes the United States not look like an honest broker at all.
But the United States has never been an honest broker. I mean, why am I the only one here who's willing to say the Israeli Jewish lobby has control of the situation in Washington? We all know it. Are you reluctant to just say it plain and simple like that?
I'd like to make a comment basically on the historical issue of the U.S. interest, or the way the U.S. has perceived its interest in the Middle East. What's being done now to Hamas is the same thing, or the creation of an enemy in Hamas, which is the U.S. has just crossed that threshold. The precedent for this is what was done in Lebanon in 1982 and 1983. Because the United States got involved in the Lebanon war and took sides, after Amin Gemayel came to power, the United States explicitly took his side, sent in troops, started bombarding his opposition, and thereby created enemies in Lebanon that didn't exist before. Basically intervening in an inter-Lebanese conflict, taking sides and then becoming a participant in that conflict, an active participant in that conflict, and setting the Hezbollah directly against the United States. Now at this point, the United States had always been an indirect supporter of Israel in terms of the aid and the military support and the political support, but by taking direct actions against Palestinian leaders like Musa Abu Marzouk, it has now crossed the barrier of inserting itself as a direct actor in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the side of Israel. And so it's, I think that what you mentioned, Mark, about this paragraph here, about the potential threat to U.S. interests based on the new opposition of Hamas, I think that if it were to happen, it would be because the United States declared Hamas an enemy. If we remember back in 1993, the United States, or prior to 1993, the United States had a dialogue with Hamas and then cut off that dialogue because they defined Hamas as a terrorist. So this creation of a conflict is being started on this end. Now I just want to expand on that point and talk about why I would say that the U.S. policy itself is a function not only of the domestic circumstances that you talked about, but also it's a function of the balance of power in the Middle East. Like what Ghassan Bishara was saying, until there is either an incentive or a disincentive to not completely identify with Israel, the United States will completely identify its interests with Israel. And the proof of that will be that if Dole comes to office as president, you're going to see exactly the same policy as you saw under the Clinton administration, not what you saw under a previous Republican administration. So until the Arab states or Arab peoples are able to assert their interests, their local interests in a strong enough way. The United States has no reason to divert from this policy whatsoever. We can't expect that change is going to come from within. It has to come from the change in the will, if you could say that, of the people in the Middle East.
You're saying might makes right to a certain extent?
Absolutely. This is a realpolitik. This is the way that the world really works, I believe.
If I may just add again to what I was saying, the unfortunate thing is that the trend in the United States is to actually get deeper into the, if I may say, the Israeli mud. I mean, I think Mr. Clinton is consecutively, progressively, has been, as of now at least, the most American president that identified with Israel interest. And I think it is obvious that in the media and political analysts, American political analysts and Middle Easterns, see him as himself perceiving himself and his ability to get reelected as weak, and therefore he wants to look for the strongest, in his perception, party in the United States that can salvage his second term. And from that point of view, he relies more and more on, or he does more and more things that would be satisfactory to what he thinks are Israeli allies in this country, American Jews and other Americans who are allies of Israel.
So why is it that a state of 4 million Jews in the Middle East, 6 million Jews in America, seems to talk about realpolitik, to be able to outmaneuver 23 Arab states with 200 million people, and you yourselves as Arab Americans, you have 4 or 5 million Arab Americans? Where is the incongruity here? Why in the world are you so weak?
Well, let me give you one response to this. This needs more than one response, and it needs more than the short time that we have. But one response to this is that, unfortunately, we who belong to the anti-Israeli part of this equation, whether we are Palestinian, whether we are Arabs, whether we are Muslims, we on this part of the equation have a whole array of forces that are stacked against us. From the United States administrations, Republicans and Democrats, to the Israeli government with its military buildup and prowess in the area, to the repressive and autocratic dictatorial types of Arab and governments in the Middle East, whether these are Arab countries or beyond. So we're really working on different fronts. As far as the Israelis are concerned, they have almost the same forces that we are working against are working for them. The United States governments, Republicans and Democrats, the Israeli governments, Likuds and Labor, and the Arab governments, whether they are kings or presidents. All of these are stacked on the Israeli side.
Does that now include the PLO?
Of course it does. The PLO, if it is given further credibility, it will emerge just another Arab state. It would be similar to something like a cross reference between Egypt and Jordan. That's the Palestinian National Authority. You can see the Palestinian National Authority.
Maybe you're being generous.
Maybe I'm being generous, but the American public out there needs this generosity. We have to build the bridge for them to understand. The Palestinian National Authority, the first thing it concentrated on was a police force. 39,000 policemen and security agents that the Palestine National Authority has in the West Bank and Gaza. What do you want a police force when you're coming into existence? If you are coming with the will and the consensus of your own people, why is all the budget going to the police around? And there's no other concentration, no other interest in the other sectors of society.
Maybe to infiltrate and repress the people, what you need are police, informers, money, and guns.
Now, you're being generous by using the word maybe.
But I think that you know, Mark, if I also may add something here, I mean, it's obvious that Mr. Arafat's authority. There are certain very, very bottom line ABCs, and one of them is when your adversary is beating your people, you try not to meet with that adversary. The same day that Israel bombed the UN compound, Mr. Arafat was meeting with Mr. Peres and shaking hands. Today, in the 11th or 12th day of the Israeli bombardment of Lebanon, the bombing of water reservoirs, the bombing of power grids, Mr. Arafat is calling upon the PNC to meet and to recognize that it's a different ball game, that we have to reconcile with Israel and make peace with Israel. Apparently even, within the Palestinian Authority territories themselves, the gap is also growing and widening between Mr. Arafat and his people.
Are you
People
saying
are demonstrating, are protesting, students are protesting, and he doesn't apparently really, he doesn't care because of all
Are
these
you saying
5 or
that-
6 levels of police forces,
Okay.
security forces.
Simply, the PNA is not a representative of the Palestinian people so much as an auxiliary of the Israeli occupation force.
Actually,
I think-
it's been called the
Saad Haddad.
SLA.
no, it's been called
Well, Edward Said has said collaborator. Edward Said has said a Vichy type government like Vichy France.
Becomes like Saad Haddad militia
In southern Lebanon.
The Israelis themselves called it the subcontractors of their security.
That's the word I was looking
Do you
for.
people on this panel foresee the day in the foreseeable future when the Israelis will have to negotiate with Hamas?
Well, the way that the Israeli authorities behaving is, it would prefer to cease to exist before negotiating with any Islamic trend in the area.
Yeah. I was going to say optimistically that's the way I would see it, because pessimistically the Israelis are going to arrange it so that no negotiation is possible.
That's not what the...
but
I would say
also-
that if the PLO, or I should distinguish between the PLO and the PNA, I think that's a very important distinction. The PLO represented 6 million Palestinians worldwide. The PNA represents 2 million Palestinians, technically, in terms of being an official entity within the West Bank and Gaza. So I think it's very important to make that distinction.
And what does Hamas represent?
Hamas represents an opposition to that official policy. If Hamas were to take over there, then Hamas would also represent those 2 million people officially as a replacement authority for Arafat's. But the point that I really wanted to make is that I think if the PNA does not survive, if it is wiped out by this process, the opposition or the collision between Israel and Hamas, in which it's currently standing in the middle, I don't think that Israel will negotiate with Hamas. I think that Israel will look to Jordan to help it to cut off Hamas. The object of them is to destroy Hamas and not to negotiate with it under any circumstance.
And what's the goal of Hamas?
The goal of Hamas is to probably get some kind of a national self-determination and equitable type of future for the Palestinian people.
I think that
I
Hamas
disagree.
represents an
I think-
idea, and as to how many people it represents is a reflection of how many people are embracing that idea, something that polls are being taken from time to time and the numbers go up and down. And as the PNA becomes discredited, more and more people are embracing the idea and are de facto represented by Hamas.
I think I disagree. I think I want to disagree on this point. I think Israel will negotiate with Hamas at one point. But Israel, they tried to milk it all the way until they get whatever they want from the PLO or the PNA for that matter, because the PLO, to my understanding, I think died.
Isn't the real goal of the Israelis to divide and rule, just like when the British first came to the Middle East? They played one Arab state, one Arab ruler off against each other. And now Israel's playing one Arab faction and one Arab group off against each other.
Of course, they're going to do that, but to the Israelis, I think they come up from different colonial point of view. It's not like the colonization of British and or other countries, because Israel is there on the land. It's going to stay on the land. They don't consider themselves as colonials per se, like the British, which is they can move back to Britain. Israelis, they consider this as their land, and they go from the zero-sum politics. They don't go from the different politics, either us or them. That's how they look at it for this point, and that's why I see it. I think the Israelis, as a matter of fact, in my opinion, they kept their dialogue with Hamas now, going in the territories where they had, and in Gaza where they kept their connection with the leadership of Hamas and the political leadership, of course. But Israel, they won't negotiate with Hamas unless that the military wing of Hamas would be